This is where I live. New York, New York. The city so nice they named it twice. This is my neighborhood. These are my neighbors. This is my home. Some people seem to think that New York can be a bit impersonal and not of human scale. I beg to differ. This is the thinnest house in Manhattan, 9.5 feet wide, and it's right on my block. Edna St. Vincent Millay lived here. See? This guy's name, believe it or not, is Mr. Hyde, but I'm sure he came by it facetiously because he couldn't be any nicer. He's been having some pretty serious health problems for the last few years, but they ain't slowed him down yet. I like to watch the local kids as they learn how to walk. They look like little drunks, which for some reason amuses me endlessly. This guy's due for a few pointers on technique, perhaps, but he gets an A for effort. This is a statue of once Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia. During a newspaper strike in the 40s, he gave a dramatic reading of the Dick Tracy comic strip on live radio. Every year at first snowfall, someone puts a globe of hard-packed snow in his hands. It makes him look a little like a kid having a snowball fight. Some of the locals help maintain the snowball through spring thaw. I know I do. I've known this guy for over 20 years. I call him Senor Triple X, after the brand of ale he favors. When he's a little hard up for cash, which doesn't seem to happen often, he'll shuffle back and forth in front of one of the local shops until someone comes out and hands him a broom. Then he'll sweep the shop's sidewalk, which it rarely actually needs. He'll accept a couple of bucks with a sweet smile and be on his way. What exactly is it you need me to explain about this picture? Certainly, I live close enough to have heard something, but I was in the shower at the time. There was no one in the street when I came out to go to work, which is not unusual in this neighborhood. But I sensed right away that something was seriously wrong. As I came around the corner into the sunlight, I could see that people had jerked their cars over to the side of the street and flung open all the doors. Groups of strangers were gathered at each door, listening intently to the news blaring on the car radios. This is how you get really, really bad news in my neighborhood, though I still had no idea what was going on. I hadn't had any coffee. Of course, when I got to the intersection, I could see everything. The way it looks now, it may be hard to picture, but this view left nothing to the imagination. Both were standing. Both were burning. Then one fell. Then the other. My recollection of the next 48 hours is intermittent. At some point, I went home. At some point, I watched a lot of the one television station I could still get. At some point, I went into some sort of shock, thank God. And at some point, I wandered out into the streets with the video camera, although I can't tell you why. I actually don't recall shooting much of anything, but I know I did because I got these shots.
Pray.
Nothing you haven't seen a million times already. What's wrong with this picture? It's impossible to describe how surreal this scene looks to those of us who are used to all that neighborhood sky being filled up with building. This is where my friend Louis lives. This is the list of New York hospitals that I worked for 2 days as I tried to find my friend Carol, who worked on the 88th floor of Tower 2. This is Carol. These are the audio meters on the video deck I've used on a daily basis for more years than I can count. I only ever use channels 1 and 2. Odd, I suppose, but until this morning, I never noticed the resemblance. I can't think of what I wouldn't give to know what's going through his mind right now. This is Union Square. This is a spontaneous gathering of the grieving and the stunned. People just showed up. This is where I lost it. What's wrong with this picture? 2 guesses. It was a bad night. This is the West Side Highway, 2 blocks from my home. It's usually jammed with traffic. We don't have a lot of highways in my hometown. Now it was the main artery for emergency vehicles into and out of what they were calling Ground Zero, which is the hole that 50,000 of my neighbors used to work in. If you look hard, you can see that there's still a city behind all that white smoke. This is about as close to Ground Zero as I could get. This is where I had to admit that my desperation was about to be no longer containable. I couldn't conceive of any rational response to such an inconceivably irrational act. I couldn't imagine how, in a world where such atrocities are kept at bay only by the presence of the most simple human decency, we could go back to some sort of ordinary lives now that that decency was gone. And I couldn't help but think that terrorism just might be the ultimate weapon after all. Unstoppable, unpunishable, complete. But pay close attention now. I'll warn you up front that this is a trick question. What's wrong with this picture? Heading back uptown from about as low as I could get, I found several of my neighbors at the intersection where my street met the road to Ground Zero. Each of them had come down, individually and with no prior arrangement, to bellow their thanks to the southbound crews starting their day in hell, and to the northbound crews heading for a few hours of rest before going south again. It was a small gesture, perhaps, but it seemed to be appreciated in a big way somehow. How old is this guy, 15? As I watched, several more of my neighbors spontaneously arrived to show their thanks. Several hundred, actually. Several hundred at first. What's wrong with this picture? Not one thing. Unless, of course, you happen to be a terrorist. If you're a terrorist, then this has got to be a pretty terrible picture. Because if you're a terrorist, then this picture is pretty undeniable proof that whatever it was you worked so hard to accomplish, you quite obviously failed. And I don't mean to sound naive, but what was it they were trying to accomplish anyway? Were they trying to convince us of the righteousness of their cause? Because of course they achieved the opposite, showing us so plainly how corrupt their ideals are. Were they trying to break our spirit? Because of course they achieved the opposite, sending shock waves of resolve and determination into the most apathetic corners of our country. Did they think that dying for their cause made them heroes? This is what heroes look like. And we've got plenty of dead ones, too, if that's what impresses them. Divide and conquer. Was that the idea? Well, the only way we could be bound more inseparably to each other right now is if we'd had ourselves sewn together at the hip. And this solidarity is courtesy specifically of those who sought to divide us. And conquered? If you're a terrorist, please take a good look at my supposedly vanquished people, whom you hit as hard as you know how, and who are tonight in shock, in pain, and in mourning. I don't know, how conquered do we look? These pictures remind me of shots I've seen of the liberation of Paris at the end of World War II. It kind of looks like we just won a war. And of course we have. Even in the fading light of our darkest day, the truth is plain. If the goal of terrorism is to spread terror, then terrorism, the ultimate weapon, is apparently completely ineffective. Because the harder any decent people is hit, the taller that people will stand. It's just human nature. What's wrong with this picture? Obviously, terrorists are about as much of a threat to our way of life as the common housefly is. And like a housefly, terrorists will inevitably dash their own lives out, with no help from us, by banging repeatedly into a window pane that they're convinced is actual sunlight. This is where I live. New York, New York. The city's so nice they named it twice. This is my neighborhood. These are my neighbors. This is my home.